Lady, what you are about to see is a revolution.
Non-violent, I hope.
This is it. Spin it.
What you're about to see could be a revolution. This is it. And you spin it.
That is a momentum engine. Oh, it's a model, of course, prototype.
This is an electromagnetic engine. Oh, it's just a model, just a crude prototype.
Imagine a flywheel 20 times heavier, revolving 1,000 times faster in a sealed vacuum.
Imagine a magnet 20 times heavier, revolving 1,000 times faster, and sealed in a vacuum.
This could revolutionize the entire auto industry. We could have cars without gas tanks because they wouldn't need gas to run.
This could revolutionize the whole world. Cars wouldn't need gas tanks because this machine runs on no conventional fuel. To most, this is fantasy. At one time, so was this. But times have changed. 5 months ago, when we first told you about Joseph Newman and his invention that runs without any kind of conventional fuel, the laughter attracted more attention than the man and the machine. But since then, a number of incidents have occurred that makes it entirely possible that Mr. Newman has discovered a new form of energy that could have a tremendous impact on all of our lives. The first of those incidents occurred in March of this year when engineers from Mississippi State University arrived in Lucedale, Mississippi to test Mr. Newman's device. Representatives of the State Department of Energy were also on hand to observe the testing. For 6 days, tests were run. Some of the tests were simple, some of the results perplexing. WWL engineers conducted one of the tests done by Mississippi State. 8 slightly used pinlight batteries in series were placed on a motor that was doing virtually no work.
That's it.
The batteries died in 1 minute and 15 seconds. Those dead, dry cell batteries that are not supposed to recharge were then linked to a portable model of Mr. Newman's invention. The batteries turned a 90-pound magnet for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Then, because of a lack of time on our part, we removed the batteries. We then reattached the batteries to the original motor. The motor ran 2 minutes and 28 seconds before the batteries died. That is twice as long as the first time. On batteries, that are not supposed to recharge. Almost any engineer or physicist will tell you that those test results should be impossible. But after 6 days of test, the senior engineer doing the testing for Mississippi State said Mr. Newman's machine did produce more energy out than in. That, too, is supposed to be impossible. But there were witnesses to that statement.
Yes, on at least 2 occasions, one of the professors, I hate to say admitted, but came to the conclusion that indeed the output was more than the input.
But when the inventor asked the engineer to put that statement in a letter to be used at a news conference, here is what the engineer wrote, and we paraphrase. I must confess that I am unable to understand Mr. Newman's theory, but I do not mean to imply that he is incorrect in any way. I realize that Mr. Newman's device would defy all known physical laws, but the evidence definitely suggests that such may be the case. Not exactly a testimonial to Mr. Newman's theory or his machine, but during the next few days, we'll show other documented tests where the machine or the theory are tested, validated, and believed, but public testimony is refused.
That machine is a dandy idea, and it just doesn't work.
Never been given a chance to work. It's been squashed.
On August 18th of this year, Joseph Newman was invited to the NASA facility near Picayune, Mississippi. Over 70 scientists and engineers wanted to hear Mr. Newman's theory. At the time, WWL was slated to tape that meeting. But the night before the meeting, we were called and asked not to come. It seems the scientists and engineers felt they would be restricted in their questioning of Mr. Newman if television cameras were present. So we agreed to stay away. For Joseph Newman, the meeting was very important. It was the first time that he had stood before so many experts in the fields of physics and engineering. Experts who had the capability of disproving his strange theory. But at the end of the 2-hour meeting, just the opposite occurred.
I asked him 2 very distinct questions toward the conclusion. I said, does anyone here disagree with what I'm saying? No one spoke up. No one disagreed. Complete and total silence. I said, well, let me ask it another way. Is there anyone here who agrees with what I'm saying? And surprising to me, vigorously, quite a few people spoke up and said, yeah.
But the euphoria was short-lived. The visits by the experts and extensive testing that the inventor had hoped for never materialized. We asked a former employee of NASA who was instrumental in setting up the meeting, why? The guy at home is going to be wondering, why is no one really interested in this?
They'll admit that it's unique, you know, right now. Yeah. But they would like to go, I think, and I think that, that a group could be gathered to go up and say, okay, we want to start from end to end and run some tests. And if this test passed, no one on earth can dispute it.
No such tests have been requested thus far, but 2 NASA employees acting on their own did test Mr. Newman's machine before the meeting at NASA. They had reservations about some of the mathematical computations that the inventor was using. When WWL volunteered to tape both of their arguments off the air and show them to out-of-state neutral parties, they refused. When we asked them to gather a team of NASA scientists to prove or disprove the machine, they refused.
And immediately thereafter, I got a call the next morning saying that they had made a mistake and that he would write me a letter stating that.
So once again, Joseph Newman and his theory have been put to the test. And once again, no one disproves it. Many agree with it. But no attempt is made to conduct definitive tests. And there is more irony. NASA tests rocket engines. An hour and a half away from NASA sits a man who claims his device would allow rockets to fly with no fuel. No one at NASA seems to be interested.
That's not negative at all.
In August of this year, Joseph Newman called one of the premier instrumentation firms in the world. He requested that engineers be sent to his home to make sure the testing equipment he had purchased from that company was working properly. On August 24th, 2 engineers tested the equipment and Mr. Newman's machine. Both were electrical engineers with 50 years' experience between them. One had a master's degree from MIT. After testing the Newman device for 5 hours, one of the engineers called me. He said the machine is simply incredible. It does exactly as the inventor claims. He then offered a letter and the test results. Plus, he and his partner agreed to an interview. But the next day, company representatives called WWL to say there would be no letter, no interviews, and the company's name should not be used. Shortly thereafter, the two engineers asked us not to use their name for fear of being fired. At that point, WWL engineers agreed to duplicate the test that the two engineers had done. After a day and a half of testing, the results showed a device 820% efficient. Now to that, engineers and physicists will immediately say impossible, when in fact that figure is misleading, because this very unconventional device, powered by a heretofore unknown process, is being measured by conventional instruments and equations. But nevertheless, the proof remains.
According to conventional theory, it can't do what it's doing. Just sitting there continuously rotating the rotor requires more power than is going into the device.
There's three forms of power that can come out of this device. Mechanical power, electrical power, and then the power that's fed back into the batteries. So there's three separate outputs of power. And actually we're only measuring one of these. So the actual power output of it is greater than what we've measured.
Before testing the machine and meeting the inventor, one WWL engineer said, in effect, the whole thing was preposterous. The other said, oh no, not another perpetual motion device. But when the tests were over, no one said preposterous, no one thought perpetual motion.
I'm absolutely fascinated. I have, of course, a certain amount of ambivalence, as most people do who have been grounded in conventional theory, in that it looks too good to be true, yet on the other hand, his theory makes a great deal of sense. It explains things in magnetic theory that were never satisfactorily explained to me by conventional theory. And if, in fact, his device does work, which I believe it does, I firmly believe we stand on the threshold of something absolutely unknown in the history of humanity. Yeah, that particular aspect is because it is.
For those who haven't heard by now, there is an inventor in Lucedale, Mississippi, who has a machine that he says will one day run every appliance in our homes, including the air conditioning and heating. And according to some experts, if the unit ever gets to the public, you will pay one time only for the unit. You will pay no utility bills after that. During this week, we've presented scientists and engineers who have tested the machine and not only agree that the unit works, but that someday it will also power cars, planes, and ships. In short, they believe the invention of Joseph Newman could possibly change the world. But those who believe are not only scientists and engineers. 13 businessmen have invested. All have different reasons for doing so. They are oil men.
I'm firmly convinced. I've seen the machine run. I've watched it turn with transistor batteries, and the mere fact that it turns just with a 9-volt transistor battery is amazing to me.
They are contractors.
Well, basically, the reason I invested was to make money.
They are real estate brokers.
It's nebulous, perhaps, but I think it has possibilities, and as long as it has a possibility, everybody should support it.
It has taken 18 years for Joseph Newman to convince the investors and the experts that he is something of monumental importance. But that's not unique. It's simply history repeating itself. When Einstein first claimed that E equals mc squared, even his closest friends in the scientific community said, impossible. When Robert Goddard, the father of modern-day rockets, first suggested a rocket flight to the moon, his fellow engineers and the media totally ignored him. And just this week, there was 81-year-old Barbara McClintock. She was labeled absolutely mad when she said her experiments with corn in her backyard proved that genes could travel. On Monday, 43 years after the fact, she was given a Nobel Prize for her work. But the bottom line to this series of reports on an admittedly strange situation is this. The inventor will never get his product to the public until he gets his patent. He now is fighting for that patent in federal court. The more experts who travel to Lucedale, test the machine, endorse the machine, the better the chances of getting a patent. But we have witnessed a true reluctance on the part of the scientific community to make that trip, to do the test, to give the endorsement. They feel that if they endorse it, and Mr. Newman is proven wrong at a later date, their reputations will be soiled. But this country still faces an economic crisis in the Middle East. Here in New Orleans, we're contemplating the doubling of utility rates. There seems to be little time to worry about reputations. So what can we do? Well, Mr. Newman and his attorneys are suggesting that pressure can be applied by the public calling and writing their congressional delegations in Mississippi and Louisiana. Obviously, it is time to prove or disprove once and for all whether or not Joseph Newman has found the key that would return power to the people. Joseph Newman is an inventor, a successful inventor. For virtually all of his inventions, he has found a market and a patent, except one. You see, in Joseph Newman's garage, there lies the unlikely results of 18 years of research and frustration. It's a machine, almost a Rube Goldberg machine, a 600-pound magnet, flashing lights, plywood cover to protect their inner workings against patent infringements. Now, Mr. Newman claims this unlikely unit converts mass into energy on a 100% conversion process. Simply put, this machine runs on its own energy. No oil, no gas, no nuclear fuel.
This prototype is simply to prove the merit of this theory. What the theory shows is that very quickly a very compact, small device can be made and be produced for the consumer, probably within a couple years of a time, that they could buy for a home, an automobile, or an airplane, or a space vehicle, or whatever. And once they buy that device, they'll never have to pay for energy again.
If you doubt this strange story, you are not alone. One of the first to doubt was Dr. Roger Hastings, a PhD in physics from Minnesota. After conducting innumerable tests, Dr. Hastings no longer doubts. Are you not talking about a machine that would change the world?
It certainly would.
Do you know how crazy that's going to sound to the people watching?
Well, just about as crazy as it sounded to me the first time I heard it. But my point of view is just that I have made measurements, I have seen enough experiments that are just not explainable on the basis of our present understanding of, my present understanding of physics. It's something that would really change the world, and it's something that any conscientious person can't walk away from. When you've seen something that puts out more energy than it takes in, and you've taken some measurements that tell you that's true, if you have any conscience at all, you can't walk away from that.
When Joseph Newman stepped before a news conference today to make his astonishing claims, sitting beside him was Dr. Hastings and representatives of the State Department of Energy, longtime skeptics, now convinced.
I was not convinced probably on the first 3 times that I saw the device and saw it tested that that indeed it put out more energy than it took in. I am convinced now. I was a little bit prejudiced, and like all people that come up with devices like this, you think they're wrong, and so you go down to prove them wrong if you're that interested. And I was not able to prove him wrong, nor were the people that I was with able to prove him wrong.
There will be much talk, much more study, many arguments about Joseph Newman's strange machine. But for those of us who worry about skyrocketing utility bills and Arab oil embargoes, just imagine, what if Joe Newman is right?
I think Einstein's going to have to take a second seat to Joe Newman.
Only one catch. The U.S. Patent Office won't give a patent. Mr. Newman's attorney, who is also a physicist, says that's because one man at the Patent Office in Washington refused to believe.
Every time the examiner would raise another point, we would meet that point. He'd say, well, there must be a hidden energy source. So we filed affidavits from all kinds of people saying there wasn't a hidden energy source. He then said, well, you ought to run this type of test. So we'd run that type of test, and it'd come out again to be the same thing. But he just refused to initially allow the case.
But for the man who has spent the last 18 years meeting the challenge of those who don't believe that he has a machine that would change our lives here in New Orleans and the world over, the latest challenge seems to be the U.S. Patent Office. But for the scientific and engineering community, Joseph Newman now has a challenge of his own.
The burden of proof is on you. I have been told that many times in the past. I accepted that, fine. The burden of proof is on me. I have put forth the proof. And what I'm asking now is that anybody who is, feels competent, who cares about the advancement of science and the human race, that they participate in this. Come down. If they can shoot me down, fine. They'll teach me something.
Incidentally, Mr. Newman's machine has almost all of the international patents available. The battle over the U.S. patent is now in court with a patent grant expected soon. But acceptance has been a long time in coming. Joseph Newman's obsession began in 1967 when he began sending his 130-page thesis to every major government department in the United States. Response was either non-existent or negative for years. But in the late 1970s, that began to change. In 1976, Senator John Stennis requested funding for the project. Later, astronaut Captain Ronald Evans approved the theory and recommended it to NASA. Shortly thereafter, in 1979, Dr. Robert Smith, Chief of Space Environments at NASA, wrote, "Because of your theory, several laws of physics may need to be re-examined." And then Dr. E.L. Moraine, one of the men involved in the making of the atomic bomb, wrote, "Your project will lead to developments that would be beneficial to all mankind." And positive reaction to this invention continues to grow, the latest of which is tremendous public interest. The public seems to be asking three major questions. Number one, why is it that this machine, which is supposed to supply tremendous energy for homes, endless energy, is not hooked up to this home? The answer is the machine is a primitive prototype built only to prove the theory. The machine would fly apart if enough energy was applied to energize a home. Question number two. The plywood facade is kept on for television cameras, but removed for scientists and engineers. Why?
I know that the only way that they're going to make a strong comment is to look inside. But I have them sign a confidential disclosure paper that they're looking at it in confidence, will not disclose it to anyone else without my written permission.
And question number three, could a hidden energy source be in the garage floor?
And I've carried it to the U.S. Patent Office, so it's easy to lift it up and show anyone that there's nothing attached beneath it.
And you've proven to the U.S. Patent Department that there is no hidden energy device?
Yes.
And again, the inventor challenges any scientist or engineers to disprove his theory.
No one who's ever sat down with me and gone over the thesis with me in my presence has ever gone away and said I was wrong.
You're talking about physicists, engineers?
That's correct.
In the meantime, interest is growing. The U.S. Patent Office, after refusing a permit because the machine defies laws of physics, now offers to give an immediate patent if a university endorses the invention. And three separate industries are investigating the possibility of investing in the machine. The inventor can't let private industry have the machine until the patent is granted, but obtaining the patent seems to be almost impossible. Examples. December 1981, following the patent application, Joe Newman calls the patent office to talk with an examiner. He is told they don't want to talk to him. Newman protests to his congressman, and a meeting between the inventor and patent officers is arranged in Washington. But on January 6, 1982, Joe Newman receives a letter that says his patent has been totally denied. A hidden energy device is suspected. But the scheduled meeting on January 27th is held nevertheless, at which time the examiner told Mr. Newman,
"I don't think I'll ever be able to give you a patent, no matter what evidence you present to me."
The reason for that statement? Patent examiners felt that what Joe Newman claimed was impossible. On March 13th, after more protests from the inventor, another meeting was convened. This time, he was told they believed there was no hidden energy device and added that they actually believed the machine worked. But now, they feel his technical description of his invention is inadequate.
And then I asked him a second time, in fact. I said, "You're saying that you agree that the energy out is greater than energy in?" He said, "Mr. Newman, you say that it does. We looked at the facts. We believe you."
Mr. Newman then protested to the Patent Office's Board of Appeals. A meeting is set for September 30th, 1982. Incredibly, at that meeting, Joe Newman is told the description of his invention is now adequate, but...
Then they went back and started saying, "We don't think that the device is now operable." Now, and also at the time of this meeting, they gave me 2 minutes at the very end of the discussion that they allowed me to get up and try to discuss at that time it was 17 years of work in 2 minutes.
So in little less than a year, the U.S. Patent Office has told the man who just may have an amazing machine, number one, they didn't want to talk with him. Number two, they will never give him a patent. Number three, the invention has a hidden energy device. Number four, there is no hidden energy device. Your invention works, but your description of the invention is inadequate. And finally, your description is adequate, your invention does not work. Joe Newman is now suing the Patent Office in federal court, but his case won't be heard until June of 1984. But the confusion and contradictions continue. Shortly after our second report, the Patent Office notified one of Mr. Newman's attorneys that if a university endorsed the invention, a patent would be granted. And now there are indications that the patent will be granted simply if two scientists with credentials endorse the machine. In the meantime, the invention that many feel will change the world remains here at the home of the inventor, deep in the woods of Lucedale, Mississippi.